The sun had long disappeared behind a blanket of grey clouds, the kind that promised rain but never delivered. The wind was biting, and the streets of the small town were eerily quiet, save for the sound of little footsteps slapping against the wet pavement. Ella, no more than 10 years old, was on her usual afternoon walk after school, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her oversized jacket, and her breath puffed out in white clouds as she trudged along, too tired to think, too tired to feel. But the sight that greeted her around the corner stopped her dead in her tracks. A dog. She could barely make out its form in the half-light, its fur matted with blood and dirt, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. The dog lay motionless on the cold ground, the faint rise and fall of its chest the only sign it was still alive. A soft whimper escaped its lips, barely audible above the wind. It wasn't just a stray, Ella could tell. This dog had been loved, tended to, cared for. Its eyes flickered open as she approached, locking with hers. It was then that Ella knew. This dog needed help. It needed her. Without thinking, without even fully comprehending what she was doing, Ella knelt down, her small hands trembling as she reached out. She could feel the roughness of its coat, the warmth of its skin beneath. The dog winced at her touch, but its eyes never left her face. It trusted her. And in that moment, the world felt impossibly heavy. She couldn't leave it there. Not like this. She had to do something. With a sudden resolve, Ella slipped her arms beneath the dog's broken body, lifting it with all the strength her small frame could muster. The pain in her chest wasn't just the weight of the dog, but the weight of the responsibility she knew she had just taken on. Show your love. Hit like, share, and subscribe for more. Ella's boots crunched against the damp pavement, the sound almost comforting in the silence of the small town she had called home for the last 10 years. It was a town where the streets were empty by 7 p.m., and people didn't bother locking their doors at night. Here, life was quiet, predictable, comfortable. But for Ella it was more than that. It was safe. She had lived her entire life with this rhythm. School, then the walk home past the same houses and familiar landmarks. Always the same road, always the same peaceful feeling. There was a certain kind of stillness in the town that wrapped around her like a blanket. Sometimes, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. The autumn air was crisp, the kind that made Ella feel alive but didn't bite too hard at her skin. Leaves, still rich with color, swirled around her feet, chasing each other in gusts of wind as she walked down the street. The sky above was a pale blue-gray, the clouds heavy with rain that never quite fell. It was one of those days where the quiet seemed to settle a little deeper into her bones, where the earth almost held its breath, waiting for something to happen. She didn't mind it, though. She loved this routine, the smallness of it. Ella had always been a solitary child, not by choice, but by nature. She was shy, not a stranger to the feeling of being an outsider, but it didn't bother her. Not much did, really. Her world was made of books, of animal rescues, of days spent with Max, her dog, who had been her constant companion since she could remember. They were inseparable. If she wasn't reading a book in the corner of the living room, Max was by her side, curled up with his paws tucked beneath him, or following her around the house like her shadow. He was the only one who ever truly seemed to understand her, and she loved him fiercely for it. Max had always been there when no one else had been. He had been her comfort during sleepless nights and her companion during long walks. Together, they had discovered the world in their own quiet way, exploring the fields and woods behind their house, running through the streets during the early morning hours before the town woke up. There was an unspoken bond between them, one that only grew stronger as the years passed. When Ella was younger, she used to imagine that Max could talk, that he understood her in ways no one else did, and maybe, in some ways, he did. As she walked home from school that afternoon, Ella found herself lost in thought, her gaze drifting over the old buildings that lined the street. She passed the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread always made her stomach rumble, and then the small bookstore, where she spent hours on weekends buried in the pages of mystery novels and animal rescue stories. She waved to Mrs. Mallory, the old woman who ran the post office, though the woman's back was turned as she arranged the letters. But it didn't matter. The routine felt good. It was comforting. She knew what to expect. And in a way, that predictability was something she cherished. But on that particular afternoon, everything changed. It wasn't the sound of a car passing by, or the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, or even the feeling of the cool breeze against her cheek. No, it was the sight of something lying in the middle of the street, a shadow unmoving, dark against the grey road. Ella stopped in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just any shadow, it was a dog. A large, scruffy creature lying in the middle of the street, its body twisted in a way that made her stomach churn. She could see the ragged rise and fall of its chest, and for a moment, she wondered if it was breathing or if it was just an illusion. The wind picked up, swirling around her, tugging at her hair, but she couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the pavement as her eyes locked on the dog. She knew it wasn't just a stray. There was something about the way it lay there, its body limp and vulnerable, that told her this was different. She had seen stray dogs before, wandering the town's streets looking for scraps. But this one was different. There was no wildness in its eyes, no frantic energy. It was still, silent, suffering. Ella's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't understand why, but something inside her urged her forward. She couldn't leave it there. Not like this. Not when it was alone. Slowly, cautiously, she took a few steps toward the dog. It didn't move, not at first. And then, just as she was about to turn away, the dog's eyes flickered open. The look in its eyes made her freeze. It wasn't wild or aggressive. It was filled with something else. Something softer, something more desperate. It was as if the dog knew it had no one else to turn to. And in that single moment, Ella understood. It wasn't just a dog. It was a creature in pain, a creature that needed help. And Ella couldn't just walk away. Without thinking, her hands reached down, trembling as she gently touched its fur. The dog winced, its body shuddering at her touch, but it didn't move away. Instead, it stared up at her with those wide, pleading eyes. Something shifted inside Ella then. She didn't know how to explain it, but she knew she couldn't leave this animal to die alone. Not now. Not when it had called to her silently through its pain. She dropped her backpack to the ground, her hands shaking as she knelt beside the dog. There was a faint whimper as it tried to shift, but the dog's body was broken. Ella could feel it, its ribcage shifting too easily beneath her hands, its legs at strange angles. It was badly injured. There was no time to waste. But what could she do? She was just a little girl. Alone. She didn't have the power to heal it, didn't have the knowledge of a vet, didn't know what she was doing. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Without hesitating, Ella slipped her arms beneath the dog's body. She wasn't sure how she did it, how she lifted it, how she held its weight in her arms, but somehow she did. Her chest tightened as she stood, feeling the dog's warmth seeping into her skin. It was heavy, its body limp, but she didn't falter. She couldn't. The dog's breathing was shallow, almost too faint to hear, but Ella kept moving, her arms aching beneath the weight, her feet dragging against the wet pavement. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street, but Ella didn't care. All that mattered was the dog. She had to get it somewhere safe, somewhere it could heal. She didn't know where that place was, but she had to find it. As she walked down the road, the quiet of the town pressed in on her, but the world around her felt distant. No one was watching, no one knew what she was doing. And for the first time in her life, that felt both freeing and terrifying. This was her fight, and there was no turning back. She pushed forward, step by step, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. The dog was in her arms, and no matter what, she was going to save it. She had to. Ella's arms were beginning to ache, the weight of the dog becoming unbearable with each step. The world around her had shifted. What had once been a familiar walk home had turned into a battle, and she was now carrying the weight of something that, for all her attempts to understand, seemed too heavy to bear. The dog's body lay limp in her arms, its head resting awkwardly against her chest, its breath shallow and erratic. But Ella didn't stop. She couldn't. She had made a promise the moment she touched the dog's fur. She would help it no matter what. With every step, The cold air wrapped itself around her, biting at her cheeks and neck, making the world feel even more distant, even more harsh. The small, quiet town she had always known seemed far away now, almost unreachable, as if it had grown into something unrecognizable, something larger than herself. The wind carried the scent of damp leaves, of wet earth, but Ella barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the dog. She could feel its pulse beneath her hands, faint but steady, and it grounded her. Despite the fear that rose within her, she kept moving. She had no plan, no backup, and no idea how she was going to get the dog to safety, but she wasn't turning back. Ella's breath came in short, ragged bursts, her legs aching as she pressed forward. She knew she wasn't strong enough to carry the dog for long, but she refused to stop. The streets, once so familiar, seemed endless now. The wind howled, pushing against her, as if nature itself was trying to make her give up. But Ella wasn't listening to the wind. She wasn't listening to the doubts that filled her mind. All she could hear was the sound of the dog's labored breathing, the sound of its pain, and it drove her forward. A small part of her mind wondered how the dog had ended up in such a state. Was it a stray? Had it been abandoned? The thought of the dog lying in the street, alone and injured, made her stomach twist. She didn't know who would do such a thing, but right now it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting it to a place where it could heal. She had to help. She couldn't leave it to suffer. It wasn't just about being a good person. It was about being the one to step in when no one else would. And that thought, small but resolute, made the burden feel a little lighter. Ella's arms were beginning to shake from the strain, the dog's weight pressing harder with each step. She shifted its body, trying to find a more comfortable position, but the dog didn't stir. Its body felt heavy and fragile all at once, and Ella feared with every passing second that it might slip away from her. The thought made her heart race. She couldn't lose it. Not now. Not after everything. She passed a few houses, but no one seemed to notice her. Not the way they used to when she walked down these streets. There was no one to ask if she needed help, no one to stop and offer a hand. The houses, lit warmly from within, were full of families enjoying their evenings, oblivious to the child struggling on the sidewalk with a dying animal in her arms. It was a lonely feeling. Though Ella didn't mind it at first, she had always been a quiet, solitary child. But now, it stung. The isolation pressed in on her, and for the first time, the weight of the situation felt unbearable. Her chest tightened, her breath growing shallow, and she had to stop for a moment. She leaned against a street lamp, trying to catch her breath, but the dog's weight was still too much, and her legs trembled beneath her. She looked down at the dog, its eyes half closed, and for a moment, she thought it might be too late, that perhaps it would never make it. But then, the dog stirred, just slightly, but enough for Ella to feel a flicker of hope. The dog was still alive. She wasn't too late. With a deep breath, Ella straightened up, ignoring the growing pain in her arms and back. She wasn't going to stop. Not now. She glanced down at the dog once more, her heart tightening in her chest. It was still breathing, though faintly. It hadn't given up yet, and neither would she. As she continued down the street, her steps became more measured, each one a small battle. She was no longer concerned with the idea of getting help from anyone else. The world around her felt distant, almost surreal, and in this moment, Ella understood something fundamental. The weight of responsibility wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was the knowledge that, in her hands, this dog's life had become her responsibility. If it survived, it would be because of her. If it didn't, that would be her burden to bear. The more she thought about it, the more overwhelming the task became. But there was no turning back now. The dog had placed its trust in her, and she couldn't betray it. Her thoughts turned to Max, her own dog, and how he had always been there for her. She couldn't imagine a world without him. And she refused to imagine a world where she hadn't done everything in her power to save this one, broken dog. Ella's legs wobbled as she pushed forward, her arms trembling, her hands slick with sweat despite the cold. The world around her had lost its clarity. She was no longer walking down a quiet, familiar street. She was in the midst of something raw and unknown, where every step was uncertain but necessary. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, and the dog's weak, shallow breaths were the only thing that kept her moving. With every passing minute, she realized the gravity of what she was doing. This wasn't just a simple rescue. It wasn't just a girl picking up a stray dog and walking it to the nearest shelter. This was something bigger. It was a test of her resolve, her compassion, and her strength. And though she was terrified, though she had no idea what she was doing, she would carry this dog as long as it took. She passed the familiar corners of the town, the streets that had once been full of life now feeling deserted, empty. The absence of sound made her hyper, aware of her own presence. The way her feet splashed in the puddles, the cold air that nipped at her skin, the dog's breathing. So quiet yet so urgent. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. The fear, the pain, the doubt. But in that moment, she also felt something else. A strange kind of clarity. She didn't need anyone else. She didn't need recognition or praise. She needed to save this dog, and she would. As she walked, she couldn't help but think of the dog's eyes. Those pleading, grateful eyes. And she found herself talking to it, though she wasn't sure why. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the wind. "I won't leave you." The more she spoke to the dog, the more she felt an unspoken bond form between them. It wasn't just about carrying it to safety anymore. It was about understanding that she wasn't just saving a life, she was giving it a chance. And in that quiet moment, as the dog's body shuddered in her arms, Ella knew that this was something she would carry with her forever. The weight of this responsibility, the depth of this commitment, was changing her. And somehow that felt right. Ella's legs felt like they were made of lead, each step a battle against the growing exhaustion in her small body. Her arms, still holding the injured dog, were trembling from the strain, and her fingers were numb from the cold, but she didn't stop, she couldn't. The night had deepened around her, the sky now a dark canvas, dotted with stars that seemed too far away to matter. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the pavement as if the world was stretching itself out to become more empty, more distant. And yet, here she was, moving forward, step by painful step. The town, once so familiar, now felt like a foreign landscape, its streets stretching endlessly before her. Every corner she turned felt further away from home. The quiet, too quiet for comfort, pressed against her like a weight. The only sounds were the soft patter of her boots against the wet pavement and the labored breaths of the dog in her arms. Each one reminding her that time was running out. The dog's fur felt damp beneath her fingers, slick with blood and sweat, and Ella could feel the warmth of its fragile body still pulsing against her chest. But the dog's breathing had grown more shallow, more strained with every passing minute. Ella wiped a tear from her cheek, though she didn't know when it had fallen. The chill in the air stung her skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. The weight of the dog's suffering was unbearable. She didn't know how long she had been walking, an hour. More, time had lost all meaning. Her thoughts, her focus were entirely on the dog. Her mind spiraled with worry and doubt. Was it too late? Had she waited too long? Was she doing the right thing by not stopping to get help sooner? She didn't have the answers. She only knew one thing for sure: she couldn't turn back. As Ella passed another familiar street corner, that the quiet of the night seemed to stretch out impossibly long. She had no idea how far she'd come, or how far she still had to go. The path felt endless, like the road itself was testing her resolve. Each step was another struggle, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She glanced down at the dog again. It was still breathing, though faintly, its body limp and broken. The sight made her stomach twist. She couldn't lose it. Not now. Not when she was so close. The pain in her arms was growing sharper, the strain of carrying the dog threatening to make her collapse, but she refused to stop. Her body screamed for rest, her muscles burning with every movement, but Ella pushed through the pain, her resolve hardening. She had always known that she was strong, stronger than most people gave her credit for. But now, in this moment, she realized just how much strength it took to carry another life. To shoulder the burden of responsibility for someone, something that depended on you completely. For a moment, she thought about giving up, about finding a bench to sit on, resting for just a minute before she continued. But then the image of the dog's eyes, those deep, pleading eyes, flashed before her, and she couldn't. She had made a promise to the dog, to herself. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let it die on the side of the road. The streetlights ahead seemed like a distant dream, their light flickering weakly in the dark, and Ella pushed forward, her legs growing more wobbly with every step. The wind picked up again, biting at her exposed skin, and the rain she had been expecting earlier finally began to fall. The droplets splattered against her face, cold and relentless, but Ella didn't care. She could feel the wetness soaking through her jacket, could feel the cold creeping into her bones, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered but the dog. The road ahead seemed never-ending, like a great stretch of darkness, but Ella pressed on, each step a defiant movement against the pain, against the doubt. It was as if the world itself had turned its back on her, leaving her alone, with only the weight of the dog in her arms and the sound of its fragile breaths. The town had gone quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation, but Ella refused to stop. She refused to listen to the doubt. She would make it. She had to. And then, through the haze of exhaustion, she saw it. A light in the distance. Faint, almost a shimmer through the fog, but unmistakable. The glow of headlights. Someone was coming. Her heart gave a frantic leap in her chest. She had made it. Help was on the way. As the car approached, Ella's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She waved her free hand, almost frantic in her urgency, and the car slowed down, coming to a stop just in front of her. The driver, a man with dark, concerned eyes, rolled down his window, his voice cutting through the cold night air. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes immediately locking onto the dog in her arms. Ella's voice cracked as she tried to speak, but all that came out was a soft whisper. "Please, help." The man didn't hesitate. He opened the car door, stepping out into the cold with a determined stride. Without a word, he took a glance at the dog, then reached out to help Ella into the passenger's seat. She didn't question it, didn't even hesitate. She climbed in, her arms still clutching the dog tightly against her chest, and the man gently closed the door behind her. The car started, its engine humming to life, and Ella glanced out the window, her eyes wet with unshed tears. She had made it. After everything, after all the pain, the uncertainty and the exhaustion, she had made it. The man didn't speak for a few moments as he drove, his eyes flickering between the road and the rearview mirror, where Ella sat holding the dog. The car's heater blew warm air into the small cabin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ella felt a little bit of relief. The fear and the doubt that had gripped her were slowly easing, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. The dog was going to make it. It had to. They drove for what seemed like hours, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car, until they reached the outskirts of town. The lights of the animal shelter were a welcome sight in the distance, a beacon of hope shining through the dark. Ella's heart surged with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. She had done it. She had carried the dog through the darkness, through the unknown, and now she was about to hand it over to those who could truly save it. The car pulled up to the shelter, and Ella felt a rush of relief as the doors opened and the shelter staff rushed toward them. They took the dog from her arms gently, carrying it away toward the care it so desperately needed. Ella stayed behind for a moment, watching them go, her hands still trembling from the weight of what she had just done. She had made it. The dog was going to survive. As the man who had helped her turned to leave, he paused and looked at Ella. "You did good," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You saved that dog's life." Ella could barely speak. All she could do was nod, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back the tears. She had done it. She had saved the dog, and in doing so she had saved a part of herself too. The man smiled at her one last time before walking away, and Ella stood there, alone in the cold night, watching the lights of the shelter flicker through the window. She had carried the dog through the longest mile of her life, but now, as she turned to go home, she realized that the journey had changed her. It had made her stronger than she had ever imagined. And no matter where the road ahead led, she would never forget the weight of the responsibility she had carried and the life she had saved. Ella sat in the waiting room of the animal shelter, her hands still trembling despite the warm air from the overhead heater. She couldn't stop staring at the door through which they had taken the dog. The world outside was dark, but the lights inside the shelter were bright, almost blinding. The sterile white walls, the hum of fluorescent bulbs above, and the occasional murmur of staff talking on the phone filled the space. None of it felt real. She was here, in this unfamiliar place, but all she could think about was the dog. She had done everything she could to save it, and now all she could do was wait. Her heart thudded in her chest as she thought about the dog, its broken body, its terrified eyes, the way it had seemed to cling to her as if she was the only thing that could save it. She hadn't realized how much that moment would stay with her until now. The weight of that responsibility, the certainty that she was its only hope, had settled deep in her soul, and no matter how many times she tried to distract herself, her mind kept returning to it. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight, the small hands moving slowly, like the passage of time had become as heavy as the weight she had carried for miles. Ella's stomach growled quietly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten all day. She hadn't even noticed the hunger until now. She had been so consumed by the task at hand that food, sleep, and even comfort had all fallen by the wayside. Her mind flickered back to the long walk she had taken, each mile feeling longer than the last, each step carrying the heavy knowledge that the dog was depending on her. There were moments when the weight of the situation had threatened to break her, but she hadn't stopped. And now, sitting in the sterile waiting room, she realized just how much that journey had changed her. She had carried the dog physically and emotionally through the darkest part of the night. And in doing so, she had learned more about herself than she ever had before. Ella's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A woman in a white coat, with her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, appeared at the door. She was holding a clipboard, her expression serious. But there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, something soft, something hopeful. "Are you the girl who brought in the dog?" she asked, her voice gentle but full of authority. Ella nodded quickly, her throat tightening. She didn't know how to respond. All she could manage was a soft, "Is it okay?" The woman glanced down at the clipboard and then back at Ella, her face softening. "We're doing everything we can. The dog is stable for now, but it's going to need some time. We're giving it fluids, and we're monitoring its temperature. We're hopeful, but it's still very fragile." Ella's chest tightened. She wanted to ask more, wanted to demand answers about what would happen next, whether the dog would make it, but she was afraid. Afraid that hearing the wrong answer would shatter the fragile hope that had taken root in her chest. She had carried the dog for miles through the rain, through the pain, through the uncertainty. She couldn't lose it now. Not after everything. "Is there anything you need me to do?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked at her for a long moment, as if considering her question carefully. "We'll let you know when we have more information. But for now, all we need is your contact information in case we need to reach you. And we'll keep you updated." Ella nodded, her throat thick with emotion. She scribbled her name, her phone number, and her address on the form the woman handed her. She had never felt so small in all her life. The weight of the responsibility still sat heavy on her shoulders, but for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe a little. The dog was alive. It had made it this far. The woman turned to leave, but then paused. She looked back at Ella, her gaze softening further. "You did something very brave today, you know. Not everyone would have done what you did. It's not easy to carry a living creature for miles when no one else is around to help. You saved that dog's life, even if you didn't realize it." Ella swallowed hard, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. She hadn't done it for the recognition. She hadn't even thought about the possibility of people noticing or praising her for what she had done. It hadn't been about that. It had been about the dog, about its need. But hearing the words from someone else, from someone who had seen it all, the rescue, the danger, the exhaustion, it made everything she had done feel real. She offered the woman a small, shaky smile. I couldn't leave it. It was in so much pain. I had to help. The woman nodded, as if understanding completely. I'm sure the dog appreciates it more than you know. As the woman walked away, Ella sank back into her chair, her hands still trembling, but now there was something else, too. A quiet sense of pride, of accomplishment. She had done it. She had carried that dog through the longest night of her life. She had made it through the miles, the doubt, the fear, and she had done it with no one to help her, no one to guide her. It was just her and the dog, and for the first time, she realized that maybe that was all she needed. The clock ticked on, but it didn't feel as oppressive anymore. Each passing minute felt like a step closer to the moment when she would finally be able to take the dog home. She wasn't sure what that would look like, or if the dog would ever truly recover, but she knew one thing: she had done everything she could. She had given it a chance. Her thoughts turned to the people in her town who would soon hear about her actions. She hadn't done this for recognition, but part of her wondered if people would see her differently now. Would they understand what she had done? Would they understand the weight she had carried? The decision she had made to step up when no one else did? She didn't know, but she didn't need them to. The dog's life, that was what mattered. And if that was all anyone ever remembered, that was enough for her. A few hours passed, the quiet waiting room stretching on as she fought back sleep. Finally, a nurse came to the door again, her expression more relaxed this time. "It's looking good," the nurse said with a soft smile. "The dog's holding steady, and it looks like the worst is behind us. It still has a long recovery ahead, but we think it's going to make it." Ella's heart soared. It wasn't over yet, but it was the news she had been waiting for. The dog was going to survive. As she left the shelter later that night, the stars above seemed a little brighter, the world outside just a little warmer. Ella had done it. She had carried a life through the darkness, and in doing so, had found a strength she never knew she had. The weight she had carried for so long had been lightened, if only a little, but in that moment, she knew that no matter what came next, she would never forget the night she saved a life,